Hi, I'm Chance.
And I'm Sarah Catherine.
And this is Conservation Connection. We run a wildlife education nonprofit focused on connecting students to their environment.
Each week here on Conservation Connection, we do just that by introducing you to the groundbreaking science and conservation work that's happening every day around the country.
We talk to professionals in the world of conservation science and wildlife management and ask them about their career,
their current projects,
their wild and crazy stories from the field,
and everything in between.
Join us each week to discover just how these dedicated people are working to protect our planet. Alrighty guys, welcome to another episode of Conservation Connection. We are very excited to be at Scofflaw Brewing for our first set of live podcasts. And beyond that, we are incredibly excited to be here again with Dr. Troy Keller.
Woohoo! Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Keller.
It is absolutely my pleasure to be here.
So, the last time that we interviewed you, we titled the episode A Lot of Dam Research because we were talking all about the effects that dams have on first, second, third order streams in the watershed. And you just kind of casually threw in that you also study asticology, which is?
The study of crayfish.
The study of crayfish. So I think for a lot of people that live around the Chattahoochee, a crayfish is a crayfish is a crayfish. And you're here to tell us that that is not true.
That is absolutely not true. We actually are very fortunate because we're sort of sitting on the very edge of the center of biodiversity for the asticologists across the globe, right? Literally, the global biodiversity maxima is right in this backyard. So
this is the mecca of crayfish.
This is mecca for crayfish.
So people that don't know, if I had to guess, I'd be like, we probably have like 4 different species of crawdads and mudbugs running around. How many species do we have in our watershed?
So if you just define our watershed by the Chattahoochee, so not even including the lower part and of course the Flint, we're talking 16 different species or more.
That is a lot. And if we were to expand that out to like the American Southeast in general, generally speaking, how many crawdads do we have around here?
We're talking over 200 species in that region.
And how, I think people, when they think about one species being different from another, are thinking about the difference between like a mockingbird and a crow. So for crawdads, is it, or crawfish, crawdads, what is the preferred term?
Yes, all of those things.
All of the above.
Is there a
Absolutely.
wrong way to say it?
Scientists say crayfish, but it really depends on your local vernacular, and so people call them crawdads. I grew up calling them crawdads as a kid and everything. So yeah, that's totally legit.
Solid. So how do you tell one species of crayfish apart from another species?
Well, it would be really nice if I could tell you that it's just like, I can look at one color and I can look at another color and it's like that simple. But
nature is never that simple.
It's
rarely that simple.
Not quite that simple. And really, in this case with crayfish, the scientists who defined the different species had a really difficult time deciding which were which, right? So they could tell that they were different, but to find characters that consistently identify one to another is really difficult. And so this is a little embarrassing to say on the podcast, but I will admit that they're actually defined by the genitalia of the male reproductive crayfish. So I'll have to explain all of that. But there are non-reproductive males and there are reproductive males, and it really depends on the shape of the reproductive male genitalia.
That's very
crazy.
patriarchy in the crawdad world. That's how we're defining
It's very
them.
frightening. It is. It's very disturbing.
So let's unpack that a little bit, because I know next to nothing about crayfish. So there's reproductive and non-reproductive males.
So there are actually 3 different families of crayfish across the globe. And in the Southeast, we happen to have the Astacidae family. In that family, they have this really weird quirk, which is not found in any of the other crayfishes across the planet. And that weirdness is that the males undergo a change throughout the season. So half of the year, they're just males running around. They have genitalia, whatever, but they can't reproduce. And their pinchers, the things that people always want to avoid, get actually smaller relative to their body size, which is just a weird thing.
Throughout
right?
the year?
During the time that they're non-reproductive, they
Wow.
grow big, but their pinchers don't grow during that time.
That's crazy.
And then when they get into reproductive mode, the genitalia switch and they grow these larger pinchers, right? And we can talk about why that is and all that. It's very interesting sexual selection sorts of things that are going on there. But suffice it to say that the thing that distinguishes species, like literally one species from another, has to do with whether those Form 1 males, the structure of the genitalia in there. And yeah, it's a little weird.
That is absolutely wild. It reminds me a lot. I don't know if there's any Futurama fans in the audience, but if you know the show, there's a character, Dr. Zoidberg, who's basically a human crayfish. And he has this whole episode where he goes into his reproductive cycle for the thing. And it's like a whole thing. And so the fact that defining one species of crayfish from another species of crayfish relies on where they are in the reproductive cycle, and like being able to tell that one male from another is just, it's like stranger than fiction for me.
It really is stranger than fiction. And I think a lot of asticologists would be very happy if we could come up with another system, right? So they are working on some genetic means to be able to identify differences. But one of the really interesting parts about that is this idea of what are called cryptic species. I don't know if you've ever come up...
Hidden, right?
Hidden.
Or hard to find.
Hard to find in the sense that you have two things. You think they're the same. We've been calling them the same for years. And then we look at them genetically and find out, well, they're not the same thing. And there was a case just recently, it was in the last 4 or 5 years, where Fish and Wildlife Service was getting ready to review a species for listing. So there are very few crayfish that are listed as endangered or threatened on the national list, right? So, right. And the Endangered Species Act. So this was going to be a special thing, and it turned out they had 3 different populations that they thought for this one species. And it turned out when they did really careful genetic analysis, just before they did the listing, they found out it actually was 2 different species. And so they ended up not just listing one as endangered, they actually had to list 2 different species.
Wow.
And at the same time, they were defining a brand new species.
That is absolutely wild. And this is the nuts and bolts of science that I enjoy, because it's this sort of intersection of like, what is a species, right? Like, how do we define a species? It used to be like, oh, they all look the same. They have the same number of legs. And they were like, oh, well, sometimes males and females look different, so we should probably divide it by that. And now we're using such fine tools as like genetic analysis to take a look at 2 ostensibly identical individuals and say, well, when you run a genetic panel, these are incompatible species. You know, they don't reproduce together. They're separate populations. And so we have to classify them separately.
Yeah. It's pretty crazy. And it even gets more crazy than that. I can tell you a story that I have mentioned to many of my students. But so, you know, one of the really fascinating things about this question of what is a species has been sort of the question of the evolution of species, right? You think about Charles Darwin's original writings and all the fascinating things that he hypothesized back in the mid-1800s. And when you think about sort of the stories and sort of his approach to what he was doing, he was obviously using his eyes and whatever. Well, for fast forward, 150 more years, we have not really had many cases where we've ever seen a species actually evolve, right? So we know evolution occurs. We've got all this really interesting observations about changes, but it's very rare that we actually see a species. There are a couple cases where we had flowering plants and other things where we actually do see some speciation, so new species arise under human observation. But crayfish are one of those species. So there's a really cool story about the marbled crayfish And it's a murder mayhem sort of crazy story about these people from Europe who love our crayfish diversity, right? We don't have a lot of species in Europe. Europe has, I want to say less than 20 different species. So what they want to see biodiversity, they come to the United States where we are the center, right?
Yeah.
So we got these European folks coming over here and looking at all these crayfish. And of course, they pick up what they call a mud bug or something in a local pond or something, and they take it back to Europe with them and they grow them up. And of course, they sell them on a market, right? Because aquarists will pay a lot of money in Europe to be able to have these weird crayfish that they can't get access to locally. And one of those individuals that they brought back was this pretty common species that we have in South Georgia and North Florida. And that species they put into a tank. They only had a couple individuals, and it was a female. And so they brought this female into the lab, they put her in a tank, and she reproduced, which would be really weird, except that crayfish actually can store sperm. So a female could actually store sperm, and so she could have babies with another male's sperm for a pretty long time. So that wasn't all that surprising, but what was really weird is that the babies from that female were all female themselves, and they started having babies, which of course blows the mind. And so
crazy.
That sounds like parthenogenesis to
that
me.
is parthenogenesis.
Which
So,
is
so explain to me what parthenogenesis
So
is.
parthenogenesis is when a species basically doesn't have to go through a male form, right? It can just reproduce basically on its own. And there's there's Daphnia and other species that can do this, but no one knew any crayfish that could do this.
Right.
And this is a species that has never been documented in the field. So it doesn't happen in the wild. So this is something that happened in the lab. And so what they're saying is this is the very first crayfish species ever evolved. It's a new species in the lab. And here's the crazy thing. That model, that crayfish has been reintroduced accidentally into the United States in places.
As happens occasionally in the aquarium trade.
It does. We'll probably talk about invasive species, and it's been introduced here. And when they did genetic analysis, it's so distinct. It's distinct from its original population, and it's distinct from the other things. So they're now calling it an entirely new species.
That is absolutely wild.
that was
is-
a wild ride.
That really was. I mean, I didn't know crayfish went that deep, but that's pretty solid.
We could go for hours.
We will. I get the sense that, I mean, this right now is a follow-up episode based on our previous one where you happened to mention a passing interest in asticology. And I'm getting the sense that we're going to be doing like a 45-minute deep dive later in the year on
We're gonna have to
crawfish.
do a follow-up episode for
I
sure.
think you're just the golden goose that keeps on giving. So one thing that I want to bring this episode back to is talking about species that are native and invasive in the Chattahoochee River Basin and the ways in which those invasive species are changing our local ecology. So what are some of the, or perhaps the single largest disruptive invasive crayfish species here?
So the big invasive species in Columbus, Georgia, and in the Chattahoochee River right now that we're finding is, there's actually two of them, but the one that's locally really abundant is called Procambarus clarki. The common name is sort of the Louisiana red swamp crayfish.
So this is what you would buy if you're doing a crawfish boil, right?
It is the crawfish boiled crayfish. That's exactly right. Originally from the sort of Louisiana, Mississippi area.
Which is probably a huge part of why it is invasive and has, changed its original location, is that people like it. They move it around so that they can either use it as fishing bait or they can use it for a crawfish boil. And if you don't use them all up, there's a pond right there. Let's put them out there.
That's exactly right. They're not really used in the aquarium trade so much. They're used in laboratories for schools. So school children will use them. That's quite common. They're a huge food source, absolutely, and that's where they're probably introduced a lot. They're also used for fishing bait, so that's another mechanism. But they are legal to raise in the state of Georgia, and there have been several crayfish farms not far from here that have actually raised these animals, and they've probably gotten into the Chattahoochee that way.
The other thing is that if you ask any aquarist about keeping crayfish, their answer is that they are always destructive, right? They are in the same way that we think about beavers altering their environment. Crayfish do the same thing. They build dens. They absolutely obliterate vegetation depending on the species. So the idea that local crawfish farm might have lost, say 1 or 2 crawfish is not even a little bit surprising to me.
So what is it that makes our local crayfish not cause those same issues? Like, our invasive crayfish are invasive, and I'm assuming they cause issues digging into banks, etc. So why do our native ones not do that? Or do they do that?
Well, so they do a lot of similar things, but it turns out the red swamp crayfish just happens to have a life cycle and a certain set of behavioral characteristics that make it so that it puts certain species at a high vulnerability. One of the things that we've been really interested in and concerned about is that in Europe, when the red swamp crayfish was introduced there, it brought with it diseases. So there are some diseases that are specific to crayfish that they can carry around. They're water molds. And if those diseases get into crayfish that are naive, they can
have never, ever experienced that
never
before.
experienced this disease. That crayfish don't have the kind of immune systems that we have, so they don't have the ability to have that kind of memory. It literally has to sort of be a genetic piece that they've had that exposure. So the red swamp crayfish can carry disease and can spread it to other species. What we don't know is if it's doing that in Georgia, where that's a piece that we're concerned about. But
yeah, absolutely.
You have something to say about that?
Thank you, George Henry, and the Andes as a whole. So really what that reminds me of is like chytrid fungus for amphibians, right? It's this kind of fungus that was introduced into a novel group. So to give a little context, if you're not a herpetologist, like I may or may not happen to be, there's a fungus called chytrid that was introduced into places like Costa Rica that has much like here, a massive amount of biodiversity, different species of amphibians that had never experienced this fungus before. And if I'm pulling these numbers out of, a 10-year-old degree, but something about 90% of the species, the novel species in the area, were disappeared because chytrid fungus was so aggressive and, basically wiped them out to extinction. Is that the kind of same issue that we're worried about this happening to native species with crawfish?
Yeah, absolutely. In Europe, for sure, right? I mean, it's decimated the populations in Europe to the literally driving species to local extinction. Whether it's doing that in Georgia or other places that this species has been introduced, we don't know. So to be perfectly fair, we just, at this point, it's a little early.
Yeah, still lots of data to collect.
But to come back to your question, all crayfish species do make burrows or do other things which can affect ecosystems, and they are referred to as ecosystem engineers, just like, like the beavers, right? Now, they do it on a different scale, and they do different kinds of things, but they're extremely important. Locally, we did document a situation at Oxbow Meadows where we had Dr. Stanton, who was a professor at Columbus State years ago, with some students had done some sampling there, and they found Procambarus acutissima, which is the sharp-nosed crayfish, and they had found that all over the place. And we went back and sampled 20 years later as part of a class, and we found only 10% of all the crayfish we caught were still sharp-nosed. The rest were all Procambarus clarki, the red swamp crayfish. So we were very concerned that there was some sort of displacement that was happening in that area.
And for people who have kind of never thought about it, a crayfish is a crayfish is a crayfish. But, as we've been talking about this whole episode, each individual species has its own niche in the environment. And so the ways that they interact with and engineer their environments can affect massively other species, right? So this displacement of a native species with a non-native species can have much further second, third, fourth order effects that we don't know what they are, right?
Absolutely. And that's a big concern, especially in forested ecosystems, wetlands and things like that are very sensitive anyways. You start making shifts to one species to another that's an ecosystem engineer. All of a sudden, the dynamics, all the associated biofauna that live with them, right? Because they make these holes. Snakes use those holes, all kinds of, insects and things will use those. And so if you change the structure of that, or when they build those holes, or how those holes are constructed, all of that can have really significant implications for the ecosystem itself and the rest of the biota.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is a mini podcast episode, unfortunately, but we definitely will have to interview you on this topic again. You will be probably our first podcast guest to be on the show 3 times once we interview you again. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, Dr. Keller. We really appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
thanks for listening to this episode of Conservation Connection.
If you enjoyed our podcast, go ahead and subscribe to make sure you catch every episode that we post.
If you've got a minute to spare, leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts helps other conservation-minded people find the show. We'd really appreciate it.
A big thanks to everyone working to protect our planet, and a big thanks to you for listening. See you next time.